welcome to our December talk with our lovely guest, Juliana Hassel. Or if you want to correct me how to pronounce your last name, you're more than welcome to. But Juliana was one of the first artists we've ever worked with. So back in 2020, for our very first issue, we had the honor to interview Juliana. And after that, we ended up working a little bit more. And it was so lovely that we got to know her even better during our last residency cohort. And today we get to learn more from her practice, her journey as an amazing and uh, outstanding artist for our community. And yes, we're just so excited and grateful that you're here.
Thank you so much, Juliana. Honestly, it's a pleasure. To be honest with you, I actually didn't even know that I was one of your first artists that you worked with. So that is wonderful to know, and that the relationship has continued and we're here today. I'm so thrilled to share with you guys my practice. Found photo has played a huge role in my practice. I would say since the beginning, since I decided that I would be an artist. I can just bring up my slides here, just a sec. And let me just see if I can share. Let me share my screen so you guys can see. Okay. If you can let me know if you can see it. Okay, can you guys see my screen? Yes? Okay, amazing. Okay, so I'll just put you down there. Okay, so yeah, like I was saying, Fawn Photo has been a huge inspiration for me for my entire practice. And I guess I can start by just talking a little bit about how that even came to be. So I'm Juliana Harsel, first of all, a Bermudian artist based in Manchester, in the UK. And I make work based on collage. Collage is sort of like the meat and depth and breadth of my practice. It's where I began, and it's essentially like how I approach every aspect of my practice, whether it's textiles, I could be working with ink or painting or paper, and I approach it in a collage-like manner. And what I'm usually doing in my practice is looking at past events, particularly related to my heritage, which is Bermuda, and sort of reimagining some of the images that might have informed sort of where we are today. So I started working with these photos that I came across that were inspired by my family tree. So this is actually my family tree, and it connects 8 generations back to an Igbo tribe in Africa. And my uncle did all of the research, and it took him 8 years to actually complete and create this entire family tree. And this document, I would say, really informs how I approach my practice. I think when I look at what it is that I'm trying to say as an artist, it's based upon my lineage, my heritage. It's based upon sort of like my positioning in the world, like who am I and what do I want to share? And I think that comes from my relationship, thinking about my family and thinking about being Bermudian. What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a Black woman in the world? And I sort of like focus my entire practice upon sort of the peeling back layers of identity and meaning. And so because I was inspired by my family tree, I decided that I would go to the first place that I could think of where I could see if I could find out more history. And that was the Bermuda Archives. And I actually didn't find any specific documentation about my family in particular. But what I did come across in 2019 were the Bermuda slave registers, which I had never heard about. And we don't learn about any of this in school. So it really fascinated me. So what I decided to do was come up with this framework around this idea about an artifact. like what is an artifact and how can I take this word and dissect it and put it into different categories. So I'm thinking about my project, which is called Artifacts, which is an ongoing process and sort of an investigation and research. And I associated this idea of thinking about art or what we know to be as the past. If sort of leans its idea to the idea of the future and facts and where we are now, how is where we are now informed where we're going in the future. So a lot of the things that I'm looking at in my practice are sort of like historical considerations of lands that are touched by colonialism, which is exactly how Bermuda is. Bermuda is actually the UK's oldest colony outside of Virginia. And so the entire identity of Bermudian heritage is sort of based upon its relationship with colonialism. So I'm looking at that specifically in my practice. I am then trying to figure out how I can approach the works by decolonization, which is interesting because we're still a colony today. So the works are trying to look at post-colonialism, but that means that if I'm looking at post-colonialism, then it means that the work is actually based on futurism, because that is not a current state for us. We're not post-colonial, we still are. And so the works that I'm making are sort of envisioning like new futures and new sort of ways of being and thinking about world building, and then using these like sort of local themes that I experience and figuring out how I can do that on a global scale. So these are some of the images that I did come across in the archives, which I thought were pretty fascinating. And I figured I would love to use these in my first iteration of whatever body of work that I was going to come up with. And so these portraits were Annie Lusher portraits, who was a photographer in the late 1800s. And he took these photos and I was just completely drawn to them. And so then what I started to do was this sort of like digital collaging of the images, thinking about them as portals in a way, like thinking about like how when we access something that's been left from the past, but how we access it now, how that in some way, shape, or form is a way to time travel. So I started to think of these sort of like as vessels or ships that would move between space and time, and how if I access these photographs that were taken from the past in this present moment, but then use them to create new images, then that would mean that I am then writing the future as well. And so I then started to think about this idea of being nowhere, because when I think about time, it's sort of like not pinpointed by a particular place. But then also how, like, if we think about time as the sort of intangible thing, but if you put a space in between this word of nowhere, how it lends itself to being now here, which is pointing to this idea of presence. And the making of the work that we do is based upon this like present moment in time, but then how that echoes into future time periods. And so then I decided that I would do like a digital project with some of the photos that I was looking at. So initially I began with photographs from the Bermuda archives, but then I started to look wider at photographs from the British Library's archives as well. So it became more of like a diasporic project, not necessarily focused specifically on Bermuda, but looking at the African diaspora as a whole. So then I just sort of reimagined these photographs using digital technologies to make them a bit more relevant and play with color. And at this particular time, I really wanted to use digital tools to communicate, because during the time that I was working on these, it was COVID. And I felt like the digital manipulation of images at that particular time was extremely critical, and it felt really timely for me. So these were some of the images from the beginning of that project. And so then also thinking about time, still always thinking about time, which is like part of the whole reason why I make work anyway, is just to write a new future. And so I was thinking about this idea of a project called Future Was Now, and then came up with the idea to create a project that was larger than myself as an individual, as an artist, and really started to dig deeper and make relationships between the images that I had seen on the archives, on the online archives from the British Library, as well as some of the archives from Bermuda, the Bermuda government archives. And so I came up with this project, and it's based upon my family tree and also the slave registers that I came across in 2019. And looking at these images, I don't know if you can see here, but this is like an image from the Annie Lusher series that was created. And what I decided to do was take one of the people that were in the images and sort of slice the identities of each of the people. And in doing so, that would lend itself to the idea of this sort of like broken heritage, or this heritage that is not fully whole. There are like gaps in missing information in history. And what I wanted to do was sort of this mixing of identities. And so I painted, I think it was 7 images, and then I ripped all of the faces and split them up so that it became a new figuration of these people in the Annie Lusher photographs. And then after I made the paintings, I was just doing some research online and came across the actual like digitization of the Bermuda slave registers, as well as a database of all of the registers from the transatlantic slave trade, and decided that what I would do was create an entire sort of a sampling of one of the books from the slave registry books. So in 1834, enslaved people were freed or emancipated in Bermuda. And so the book that I decided to recreate were all of the names from that particular book, but it was more like a sample. So for instance, if there was like a slave owner, but then there was like a list of people who were listed under that person as like property, I would take one of those names and create one face that would then be sliced into 3 different portions and then mix them to create one person. So in a way, it became sort of like this amalgamation. So where it was one person that was represented in that photograph, because I split it 3 times, it would then create more of a grouping. So it became even more people than what was listed. And what was really interesting about this as well was I decided that I would sort of rename them. And instead of using the names that were listed in the book as property, like these given names, what I decided to do was use the slave register, the transatlantic slave register, and come up or borrow from the African names that were listed. And so it became sort of a historical fictional representation of the slave registry books in Bermuda. So it wasn't all true. But what was interesting was that this particular project prompted people to start doing more research into their genealogy and family history and heritage in Bermuda. And so that was really lovely. And then the project actually traveled to Cuba, to the Cuba Biennial. And that was really lovely because instead of it just looking at like Bermuda's heritage and Bermuda's history, it became a way that people could be connected throughout the Caribbean diaspora. So this was like a history that many countries within the Caribbean experienced. So it's not just particular to Bermuda, but that this is a story that exists between islands. And that was really lovely to do this project. So I flew there and installed the work in that space, and that was really lovely. And then the work has also had like other iterations as well. So this iteration was in Seattle, Washington, at the Wanawari Gallery. And this was also the first time that I used some of the images from my Exhale project, where I'm printing on silk and superimposing the photographs that I took of an image from Bermuda Archives, and then moved it into textiles. So that was also really lovely in that space as well. And then I also had the work travel to Mali, to Bamako, and it was there for also a biennial as well. So this was the African Photography Biennial, where I created a small iteration of the same project, but was more so looking at it from an African perspective, and also recreated this book, but without the names and more so just the poetry, and then use the thread to sort of stand in as sort of like a nod to this idea that we are all interconnected and that there's a common thread. And so, yeah, and that project was on multiplicity, difference, becoming, and heritage. And that was a fantastic project to have this work a part of. And then after that, there was a wonderful opportunity to showcase my work or my research that I had been working on with the Artifacts Project with the National Museum of Bermuda. And, you know, what's interesting about like some of the opportunities to show in these institutions is that I sort of set out in my practice to do projects that were based upon decolonization, but doing so in these institutions that are very much so still colonial today. And so it was really lovely to work on this project, which was a Traces and Pastimes, my first solo exhibition, but also the first solo exhibition that the National Museum has ever offered a contemporary artist as well. And just use my own family images to come up with a site-specific installation. So I'm using here like some digital collage, also some letter writing, looking at images from my own family archives, cousins playing marbles. This is a photograph of me and my mother on a boat. And then decided that I wanted to recreate my family tree. So the family tree that I began the presentation with, but do it more so in a physical way. And so this ended up being the project, and this sculpture, site-specific sculpture, is the actual tree. And so these lines that were connecting each of the generations, that's what that represents. And what was really special about this project was the fact that the building, based on where it is, it receives like a lot of damage during like hurricane season. And so it was really lovely to be able to work on this project thinking about biodegradable materials. So I wanted to do a work where the work could withstand the harsh conditions of the building. So like, for instance, if I were to create like collages, for instance, if I were to put them in this space, they would probably be moldy or would sustain some type of like water damage, because this building always has issues. And so it was really nice to pivot from working in a sort of analog way and work digital, but then bring that idea of digital into physical space. So I also like that idea of being able to work in multiple ways and sort of move between mediums, because that in a way lends itself to the idea that I'm moving sort of between time as well, because I feel like the work is about migration, and me working in different mediums feels like a migratory sort of act in doing so. And then this was one of the sculptures that was already installed in the space. And this is a work by Bill Ming. And that sculpture is actually called Family Circle. So it really lended itself to the space. And he also used this like blue paint to paint some of the images. And on the backs of, you can't see in this image, but on the backs of some of the people are like the slave ships as well. And so it was a really timely piece. And then what was really special about that was I ended up finding out that Bill Ming, he's a like famous Bermudian artist. He doesn't live in Bermuda anymore. I think he's based in the UK. But he's also my cousin. So it really came around like full circle. And that's what his work is actually called, Family Circle. So it sort of felt like a homecoming for that specific project. And you can see here, this is my family tree. And the tree is actually referencing sort of like all these lines between like generations. And then there was a wonderful opportunity to show a photograph that I did of one of the images from the Bermuda archives that I photographed in the Small Nations exhibition at Yale University. And so this was like a photography series that I did. And these photographs actually became the source material for the textiles, silk works that became these at the 2022 Bermuda Biennial. And there are six panels, 5 or 6 panels. And on the second panel, there's like a poem that also goes along with that as well. And that was a really lovely project. And what was so nice about this was the fact that like the images felt really delicate and you could touch them and it felt like super inviting, that you wanted to sort of be a part of the work. It had this haptic nature and feel to it. And that was really sort of my first step into textiles, was working in this particular way. And then thereafter, I had a fabulous opportunity to show some works at Castlefield Gallery in Manchester. And that exhibition was called Archives at Play. And that was amazing because, you know, my work is based upon archives, but in that particular exhibition, they were looking at archives specifically related to Manchester. But what is interesting is that Manchester is very much so historically connected with the transatlantic slave trade as well, which I didn't know this prior to moving to the UK, but Manchester was actually like the center of industrial revolution in terms of processing the cotton that would come from the south of the US. So what would happen would be, so the ships would travel from the south of the US and then come to Manchester, and the factory workers here would then process the cotton to then be like manufactured. And what's also interesting about this is that my studio that I'm currently in now is in a former textile mill. And I really feel like being in a textile mill has really informed the sort of direction subconsciously of my work. And you'll see how the work sort of transitions into textile from this collage like approach. And so these works that I had at Castlefield Gallery are also like looking at the idea of an onion, which I'll talk more about in a bit. And so thinking about the Artifacts project as a whole, these are the ideas that I'm thinking about and sort of contemplating as I'm making the work. But then there was also this fabulous opportunity to be a part of the World Reimagined. This was a nationwide project that was sponsored by the, what's it called? The National Lottery, sorry, the Arts Council National Lottery. And what they did was they had, I think, over 120 globes that would go around the UK and sort of be pillared upon different aspects of the African diaspora in its relationship to the UK. And so my globe was focused on emancipation. And what I did was I created this mother who would essentially like stand in place for this woman who was on the Enterprise ship, which was a ship that was traveling to Bermuda during those times, and she acted as a mother for all of the kids that were on the ship. And that ship ended up being emancipated in Bermuda. They all of the people that were on the ship were released and set free. And so I wanted to create this globe as a remembrance for that. And so all of these globes like traveled all throughout the UK. This is in Westminster in London. And yeah, that was a really lovely project to be a part of. And so yeah, onto the onion. So my work now is really focusing on the Bermuda onion, which essentially is sort of like the equivalent of like what cotton would have been to the US South. In Bermuda, the onion was the crop that made us quite a bit of money. And it was not only just like African peoples who worked the land, but also Portuguese people as well. But initially, African women in particular that became minders of the onion seed. And so I decided that I would use this sort of archive from this book by Nellie Musson to come up with a body of work that would pay homage to these women. And so the next sort of, I would say 2.5 years, I centered this book and decided that I would highlight women and also highlight the onion as a metaphor for layers peeling back of identity. So the onion like is not just like a motif that is used in Bermuda. It's really like what we call ourselves. Like, for instance, if you were to meet someone on the street and you know that they're Bermudian, you would say like, oh, it's nice to meet another onion. Like we've actually like adopted the onion as a term of like endearment. And so the onion serves like multiple purposes in my practice as well, like using it as a metaphor for, like I said, peeling back the layers of like who we are as a people. And so here goes the textile works. I really wanted to highlight women, but then I also wanted to figure out how to sew. So these projects were like really experimental. And at this particular time, I didn't know much about like hand stitching or sewing or anything, but all of the research that I was doing about Manchester and even like being in this studio, in this former mill, like really heightened my interest in textiles. So these initial works that were a part of that project sort of guided me over the next 2 years to dive deeper into textile making. But also like these works are based upon like found photographs as well as images or books from Bermuda archives, which that book, the Mind the Onion Seed book, is now out of print. You can't even find it anywhere. I searched high and low for about 2 years before I was even able to get access to it. And the only reason I was able to get it was because I did a presentation and I told everyone about this book. And this lady told me that she had one from her father's book collection and she gifted it to me. So that's the only reason why I have it now. And so, yeah, that book, it means so much to me. Shout out to Jessica for that. That was really lovely of her. But yeah, then, continuing on thinking about sort of like this world building and sort of contributing to this global idea of these threads between like diasporic futures. I also participated in this exhibition, When We See Us, a century of Black figuration and painting. And this was at Zeitsmoke Museum in Cape Town, South Africa. And this exhibition, I would say, really, I think, solidified for me in my mind of what I was doing. Because I think like, like when you're in your studio and you're just sort of like working on your projects, it's hard to sort of situate yourself like within a global context. It was always my intention to do so, but this exhibition really allowed me to be a part of that sort of global conversation. So this was one of the paintings from my original solo exhibition at Bermuda National Gallery, which was included in this exhibition, and it spanned the diaspora including multiple artists across generations. I think it was like over 120 artists. And it was the first exhibition of its kind on the continent of Africa in general. And so now this exhibition, like currently, right now, it's in Switzerland, and it's leaving Switzerland in a few weeks and going to Belgium. And so it's going to continue to travel. So that was a really lovely exhibition to be a part of, that global conversation around like emancipation. Yeah, this is in Kunstmuseum Basel. And then also too, like thinking about my practice, I'm thinking about the Onion, I'm thinking about the archives, but then also how could I merge my love and passion for fashion into my practice along with some of these other interests and thinking about diasporic futures. What I wanted to do with this specific project was not just like think about how the work was going to be approached from myself, like in making it, but also thinking about how people were going to then experience the work. So this was a site-specific installation done at Bermuda National Gallery for the 2024 biennial. And so this is currently up at the moment. And it's also based upon this idea of the onion. So I'm thinking of the onion as sort of growing and spawning and morphing into something larger than myself. The idea of it, thinking of it as alive and sort of become, like it's a way of becoming in a way. And so thinking of it as something that's alive, it's continually in motion, and it's just growing in all different forms and directions. And so this installation was called Organic Matters, and I wanted to use the green to think about how we have a relationship like with the land in Bermuda. And so these were some of the images that were sourced that I used to create some of the quilts that were in the space. These are like 4 little boys on a rubber tree. And this was like a laborer, like sleeping on a hammock in the lily field. And lilies are also really special to Bermuda as well. It's almost like the sister plant to the onion. So at this particular time, started to think about the onion as a crop, but also like how do we position that crop within the land, and what is our relationship with the land? So thinking about like larger ideas of the onion. And so these are just like some details. These are like soft sculptures. So I became interested in sculpture after like working with the textiles, and I was thinking about like formation. And so moving from like the quilt making to 3D forms was actually like a really huge jump for me, I would say, in my practice. And I would say that that really marked a moment of exponential growth, not just in skill, but also like in execution and possibility for like what the work could be. And so then also working on different formations of the onion, thinking of it as, like I said, something that's alive and that's moving, thinking about like seeds, like how we plant seeds and then how those seeds grow into something else. So these like bowls at the bottom sort of like represent this idea of seeding. But then also like thinking about myself and my own identity. And this is really where I started to do more work personally around who I am as a person. Like I started doing like a lot of shadow work and inner child healing, thinking about like past traumas, thinking about like my own life. And so you start to see like interesting things like coming into the works, like in this particular image, like this is hair. And also thinking about like my relationship with my own hair and how that sort of informs like my identity as well. And so those, even these like sort of vine, like I call them phalanges. I call them phalanges. I don't really know what they're called. I don't even really know what they are, but for me, they sort of represent this like rooting or these like roots of a plant or like an onion. And as that was beginning to happen for me, I would say like inwardly, like I felt like I was then like planting myself or like sort of rooting myself in my practice. And this really, I would say, encouraged me to lean more so into my experiences even more. Like it just marked a moment of growth for me in working on these. And so then that sort of like leads us like where we are now. Um, in 2024, I had a fantastic opportunity to have a solo exhibition at the Masterworks Museum in Bermuda. And what's special about this particular exhibition in this space was the fact that in their main gallery space, they've never had contemporary artworks in that space. That space is specifically for their personal collection, which is never removed. And this was the first time they invited contemporary artists to not just transform the space, but also to make works that were sort of questioning or looking and inquiring about their collection and their collecting practices. And so that was a really wonderful opportunity for me. And so the exhibition is currently on view, and it's on view until February. And when I went to Masterworks Museum to look at their collection, I noticed that like there were specific things about the collection that like really stood out to me. Is that most of the paintings in the collection were landscapes. Most of them were paintings, and there weren't like other representations of like media in the collection. Also, most of the paintings were by international artists who painted Bermuda from their lens. So there weren't like artists, there were a few, but not many artists who were Bermudian who were included in the collection. It was more so like visiting artists who would, paint like Bermuda scenery or like landscape. And so then that like made me think about the fact that there is a gap in the story of like what's considered to be like Bermudian art, but also a lack of imagination of what Bermudian art actually is and what it could be. And also that it was particularly dated and colonial, of course. And then I wanted to ask, like, does the collection reflect where we are today as Bermudian people? And so then because of that, because the collection like focused specifically overwhelmingly, in my opinion, on landscapes, I actually started to do like research on the land in Bermuda and sort of where we are today. And I came across this huge research project, which Bermuda government had actually began, I think, like 2 or 3 years ago. And it's the Bermuda Commission of Inquiry into Historic Loss of Land. And one of the stories that is overwhelmingly talked about in this particular inquiry is the story about Tucker's Town, which is now the wealthiest area in Bermuda. But historically, there was a small Black fisherman community that lived in that area, and they were forced off of their land. But now that land, is like home to like some of the wealthiest people, but also like some of the most incredible homes in Bermuda as well. So it made me think about like the land and like how we have a relationship with the land, but then also who has access to it, or who gets to work the land, but who gets to own it. It actually had me like thinking about like all different types of questions in terms of like the landscape. And so I came up with the idea of the exhibition. And what I wanted to do was approach the exhibition from a way where it's not just one medium. So I didn't want to just paint because I felt like that's what their collection already had overwhelmingly. And so I wanted to approach it like in a multimedia way. And so I knew that I was going to have collage, I was going to have textile. I wanted to have like some type of audio or video element. And so we did a film as well. But what we also did too was we looked at the collection and we pulled specific images from the collection that would lend itself to what the project was going to be about. So these two images really anchor the exhibition. This is an image by Sharon Mohammed, and this one on the right is an image by Charles Lloyd Tucker. And I chose these two images because the image by Sharon Mohammed is a Black woman in a white dress in the landscape, but she's like doing some type of work. And I think that that image really talks about like who gets to act or who has to work the land. And then this image by Charles Lloyd Tucker, I felt like it was really sort of imaginative. The fact that it has like a female figure within the cape in the landscape was really interesting to me. Also, one of the things that stood out to me in the collection too was the fact that most of the collection like includes men, and so there was also like this gap in like female representation of artists that were collected as well. And so I knew I wanted to make the exhibition centered around women. And then what I decided was interesting was the fact that I was doing this research about the land, was looking at women. On this particular image with Charles Lloyd Tucker with the cape, it was a woman in the landscape just with a cape. And so when I looked at the word landscape, the word cape was actually at the end of the word landscape. And so I was like, it could be really interesting if I make some type of cape that would center or anchor the exhibition, where I could like make it about the landscape, but not exactly about the landscape. And that's what I really love about art too, is that, you know, you can, sort of have these like nuances or like approach a work in a different way. And so this exhibition is about landscapes, but when you walk into the space, it wouldn't necessarily look like it. And I love the idea of playing with that. And so what I have around the room are my alibi figures. There are 9 of them. Each one represents 9 of the parishes in Bermuda. And then there's a matriarch at the back with a cape, who represents Tucker's Town. And so what I did was I reimagined these women as sort of matriarchal caretakers of the land, like who could have owned the land in a sort of fictional representation. And so this for me felt like play. And what I wanted to do was also bring in the phalanges, so also pointing to this idea of the onion growing and spawning. And so on the back of the, like in the backgrounds of like all of the collages, the paintings, I'm also using the ink paintings, which are my onion spawns as well, but they're sort of based upon some of the flora that exists like within Bermuda, but also like reimagining some of that flora as well. But because it's about landscapes, I didn't want to just like put them in the landscape either, because I felt like that was so obvious. So I wanted to play around with that in a way. And then on the cape, hopefully I put more images of the capes close up, but on the cape are images of landscapes, like archival images of landscapes in Bermuda. And what I've done is I've reimagined those images into crests, which would represent each of the 9 parishes in Bermuda. So there's one image that represents one crest, and then one of the women who's like a matriarch, she would be paired with that specific area on the island and the crest. And so then I also was doing like research as well, where I seen like a bunch of images of women in white dresses. And I really wanted to incorporate that into the exhibition as well, which would then bring into the conversation Sharon Mohammed's image of the woman who was like hanging up like a white cloth in the landscape from their collection. So I did like a bunch of collages of some of these women, and some of the backgrounds on some of the images are based upon images from Bermuda archives, but then also I used like maps as well as like historical documentation from the actual court case of the historic loss of land, which was like all public and available for anyone to access. So you could see like here it says public crossroad. This was like a drawn sketch of like someone's land, and this is like Harrington Sound. And so I'm using the images specifically from that court case where the government is like suing people for stealing land in Bermuda. And so that was interesting for me to like sift through that documentation, but also listen to some of the accounts of people telling their truth about how their land was essentially stolen, like during that particular time. And so here are more images. And then these are like all of the collages that I did with women wearing the white dress. And you could see here as well, like this is the image that you saw from the other project with me and my mom. And then also like a lot of these images are made on actual like proofs from Bermuda archives as well, like some of the ones in the lily fields, as well as like this one, for instance. You can't see it up close. I wish I had closer ones. But it was just like the landscape, like Bermuda taken in like 1890, in the 1890s. And then this was also like a part of the installation as well. So it was inviting people to like lean into their senses and to remember place and to remember like the land, but then to also write like a short note that would sort of like pay homage to what they're thinking about when they are in relationship to the land. And then these flowers also like lend itself to this idea of giving people their flowers. And I really wanted it to feel like a place of like reverence and a place that was like shared and people were welcomed. But I also really wanted to highlight like the women that Nellie Musson like talked about in her book, in the Mind the Onion Seed book. And so those flowers were sort of like paying homage like to those women that she talked about in that book. And then also these were like making reference like to the onion itself. And so here are some better images of the work. So it was really interesting to see this work here because usually it has like they have so much of their collection out at once. And so this is sort of like the most breathable I've ever seen this space in comparison with like how it usually is. And to also see contemporary artworks in this space at Masterworks was also quite surprising, like to a lot of people in Bermuda, because that space really isn't lended to contemporary artists. And then also I wanted to bring in the white dress as well. And so this is in the front of the mannequin. And yeah, this is maybe a better image of all of the collages as well from the show. And that is it. That is all I have to share today. But I really hope that sort of the beginning of the projects, you could see like how they're sort of like all interconnected and there is a common thread like between all of them. And found photo has really transformed my practice and sort of the direction that I've gone in. And it's not only just like changed my practice, but I really feel like those images that I have continually come across have like changed me as well and my perspective, thinking about time, thinking about migration, connectivity between themes and images. Yeah, I'm thrilled to share this with you guys. And I don't know if you have any questions or anything, but I'd be happy to answer. And I don't know if I should leave this up. Okay.
Thank you so, so, so much, Jerde. This was such an inspiring
I don't know where you
talk.
are.
Oh, we see your beautiful
Okay.
face now.
Okay.
I think if you stop sharing, then we'll be able to see everyone. But it's wonderful to be able to see like the first steps to now and see your evolution. And sometimes I think as artists, we hesitate a little bit when it comes to experimenting with different techniques and thinking, well, maybe it won't translate or I shouldn't explore more. But you're such a wonderful, um, your work is such a wonderful reminder that regardless of how we're working with these images and the themes, they are all interconnected and there's a common thread. And it was really exciting to be able
Oh,
to
thank you so much.
see it
Thank
all.
you. Yeah, it's interesting like thinking about some of the other mediums because I initially when I began in collage, I chose collage because it felt most related to the way that I think. I love collage and like this sort of idea that you can cut out or add something or remove something. I felt like collage was the thing that actually made me or sort of gave me the audacity to say like, oh, I could do this with like historical things too. Um, and it's interesting, I didn't know how to approach my work through painting in that way, but collage really allowed me access to feel like, okay, I could do this or this could make sense if I'm collaging like a historical fictional narrative of something, then it's accessible. Like I could do that. Yeah.
That's amazing. And I want to open the space if anyone else
Yeah.
wants to comment something or have a question. Go ahead, Lori.
Well, I, I mean, this is quite emotional. I don't know. How do the rest of you feel listening to this? I mean, I'm deeply, deeply moved. As
Thank you so much.
yeah. I keep thinking about the massive amount of work that you have done, and then wondering how do you apply for grants? I mean, where is the support for your vision and mission coming about? And
Yes, I mean it's a good question. I'm still trying to figure it out. So there have been moments where I have applied for grants. So I've gotten I think two grants from Bermuda Arts Council. They've they sponsored my initial exhibition.
yeah,
Um, so I received funding there. There was a wonderful anonymous donor for my most recent exhibition at Masterworks. Yeah, so that was really lovely. So that was how that was able to come to be. But in terms of like when I'm not preparing for an exhibition, like just sort of like the day to day, I try to apply for grants. Like I did receive one grant from the Arts Council here in the UK, the Develop Your Creative Practice grant. I did get that one. And so I'm in the process now of actually submitting more applications
yeah,
because I
yeah,
have, lots of ideas and, projects that I want to work on. But, it's a great question because it's an expensive practice,
yes,
it's
yeah,
very expensive, especially like now that I've moved into textiles. Oh my goodness, it's like even more. So at the moment, I've just sort of been, applying for grants here and there, but also like I sustain myself through like freelancing. Like sometimes I do workshops, sometimes do like artist talks like this. I also like have a shop as well and I sell like some of my works as well. And people have collected like some of the works. So those sorts of things have allowed me to sort of like sustain myself throughout the process, but then also like reinvest like back into the practice, like buying material, buying sewing machines. Yeah, doing residencies, that's also like really helped as well.
yeah.
Yeah, it's been good. And
Well,
I'm
I
just
mean,
making it up as I go along, really.
yeah. Well, you're doing stuff at such massive scale, you know.
Yeah.
It's kind of one of those things where someone needs to come alongside and also begin to write your biography.
Oh, I appreciate that.
Yeah,
I mean,
because the level of commitment to thought and concept
Yeah.
and to taking this very seriously. I mean, wow, what an honor to hear
Thank
this
you.
today, and quite a deep inspiration. I'll remember this for a long time.
Oh, thank you so much. That means a lot to me. I just want to say, like, you know, working on these projects and just being an artist in general, like, it's changed my entire life.
Yeah.
I initially like went to law school and I hated it, and I, left law school to pursue this. And so I told like, it was so interesting because I told myself that I was an artist, but at the time I didn't have any art work or anything. So like when I decided to leave law school, that was crazy because it was just like, you say that you're gonna be an artist, but you don't have any artwork to show for it. But I always knew from somewhere that, no, like, I have these amazing ideas. I just need the time and the space to just execute them.
Yeah.
And so ever since I made the decision to be an artist, I was like, okay, yeah, I'm like, I'm all in. I left law school for this. I got rid of my scholarship for this. Like, I'm all in. And so I've just sort of approached the practice sort of with that tenacity, like from the beginning, I would say, and, wanted to really work on works that were important to me, but not just like important to me, but also like looking at topics that I think are just important to everyone in general.
Yeah. Profound.
Thank
Congratulations.
you.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much. I don't know if anybody else has any questions.
I wish I had a question. I'm just sitting here and digesting the work, like the scope, the scale of your work, the poetry, the depth, and just like I'm just so in awe of you, honestly, like in your work. It's beautiful. And just like you bringing your work into these colonial spaces as well, and just like the power of that, like I'm just sitting here like clapping, and like I said, I'm in awe right now. Yeah. I wasn't as familiar with all of your work, and seeing it in this presentation. I'm just like, wow. So I guess I just want to give you some of those flowers here too. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And that's why I like to do the presentations, because I think, like, seeing the work on Instagram, you would see like, a few things here and there, but I really think it's important to actually like hear from the artists as well about the work. I think it's so vital to really understand not just the work, but also like who is the person like making the work. And because I also feel that, as artists, like, we're making directly from our life and our experiences, and those stories are really important as well, I think, to have more of an understanding of the work, and like why it's important and why that person's like making what they're making.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree with everyone. Just absolutely stunning. The depth of research that you put into this, I commend you. I wish I could see these pieces in person. I really do. The
Thank you.
screen just doesn't do it justice.
It really doesn't. It really
no.
doesn't. Yeah.
The textile work, I love it. Really stunning.
Yeah, thank you. And the textile works are exciting for me because I really feel like it's the place like where I've been able to play, because sometimes I feel like with my research, it's such like serious topics that the textile and the color really allows me to make the work accessible in a way, like where anyone is welcome, anyone can enter this space, anyone can receive the work, and it feels like play for me. It feels like I get to play, like even like the fashion thing with my most recent exhibition. I was always like dressing up as a kid. I'm sitting here like looking at a photo from my childhood. I'm like literally dressing up with like my mom's clothes, and it's always been sort of like that idea of play for me. And in the studio is where I feel like I get to do that. Like I get to create whatever I want. And so the textile work feels like a childhood pastime.
Well, maybe you can collect some old textiles and weave your memories from childhood into some current
Oh,
pieces.
that's a good idea. That's a really good idea. I have a bunch of fabric here that I've been collecting. And also like I'm collecting like fabrics from textile mills here in the UK. Like there are still some mills in the area. So like I have like a bunch of scraps that I'm also thinking about using in the work, and thinking about like those textiles carrying memory and you know, having narratives of their own, but also like thinking about sustainability and trying to figure out a way that I can make that work in like more efficient and more sort of considered way, where I'm considering the environment, because the textile industry is very damaging, of course, most people know, like to the environment as a whole. And so working in textiles, like I'm thinking about that too. Like how could I make it like more sustainable in my practice? So
Well,
yeah, using
Yeah.
the
We've got quite a few local places now that all they have is repurposed fabric. I don't buy since 2020. I no longer buy new fabric as a quilter. I've got plenty. And even now where I work, we have these clothing drives and people donate stuff. And I just got this velvet jacket that with this silk lining. People like, what are you going to do with that? It's like men's extra large. I'm like, I'm going to cut it apart. This is amazing fabric, you know? So
That's
yeah,
amazing.
there's so much out there. So kudos to you to start repurposing.
Yeah,
Yes.
for sure.
You know, I'm taken with the work right now also of Freya Galley, who wrote the New History of Collage. And what you seem to have in common with her is basically saying, this is what was.
Mm.
And some deep acceptance around, okay, we know this, right? And this is what can be. And they are both true. And let's look at those things. You know, she's talking about the fact that Picasso didn't invent collage. You know, what is the new? In other words, what is the future look at based on what we know about the past? And there's this air of optimism recording, you know, what it is that you're seeing, but this profound level of optimism. I commend you for that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm thinking about collage as a whole, and just like thinking about collage and sort of like how it even is situated within history as well, and how it was a marker for the new, but in a way that was using what already was, and reimagine that, sort of like reimagining that space of possibility. I think that collage lends itself to is really exciting. And like you said, it that then leads itself to like this idea of like optimism for like what could be. So I deeply resonate with that.
Right. And plus the other idea that what we are is what we are. However, with collage, you can be with the world, right? And history and the future. And so you're not stagnant. You don't have to be bitter. You can be optimistic and hopeful. So I just see that in you. I see it in her just saying, hey, I don't have to prove anything.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. I don't have to prove anything. I'm just saying that there is more.
And then also too, I think what's exciting about that too, just as like for artists in general, I think like we have such a power to be able to remake, like we create things. And so I think that there's such power that comes with that, the fact that you can write something new. I think in general, like before, like you had to get permission to do something, or like there was a lot of like gatekeeping or like red tape. But now, especially like with, you know, social media and technology, like you can literally create anything from your own space in your own room. You can record yourself. You have access to so many tools that allow for the possibility to write your own story. And that's what I really love right now, is that we can write an entirely like new story.
Yeah. Yeah. It's profound.
Everyone, thank you so much for being here today. You're amazing. Thank you for inspiring us so much. Thank you for making the work and being so generous with sharing your time and your knowledge. And I hope you all have a lovely holiday season, and we'll see you all very soon again.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much. And I hope you have a good holiday. Thank you for having me, Juliana.